See, work is sharing the PowerPoint. That's frozen.
Julian, while we're waiting, Brenda's going to give a talk on a Jewish
pirate.
A pirate.
Yeah.
He was a rabbi. And I thought I might give the same talk to the men if they, well, slightly different to Brenda's, but the same sort of talk to the men. Do you think that would be all right?
Why not? Yes, we could do that. Brenda, is yours going to be at tea at 3?
Tea at 3, yes. Yes.
Yeah, because we don't really have an equivalent, Jeff, so we'd have to do it as a one-off.
As a one-off, yeah.
You start one.
Yeah,
you could start
Okay.
one, yeah.
Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, okay. We've got the kids are all on school, so hopefully my connection will be okay. If not, I'll switch to my mobile one. So okay. Off we go. Right. Here we go. Iris, over to you.
While I get it a bit bigger. Right. The children of Israel multiply in Egypt. Threatened by their growing numbers, Pharaoh enslaves them and orders the Hebrew midwifery to kill all male babies at birth. When they do not comply, he commands his people to cast the Hebrew babies into the Nile. A child is born to Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, and her husband Amram, and placed in a basket on the river, while the baby's sister Miriam stands watch from afar. Pharaoh's daughter discovers the boy, raises him as her son, and names him Moses. As a young man, Moses leaves the palace and discovers the hardship of his brethren. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and kills the Egyptian. The next day, he sees 2 Jews fighting. When he admonishes them, they reveal his deed of the previous day, and Moses is forced to flee to Midian. There he rescues Jethro's daughters, marries one of them, Zipporah, and becomes a shepherd of his father-in-law's flocks. God appears to Moses in a burning bush at the foot of Mount Sinai and instructs him to go to Pharaoh and demand, "Let my people go, so that they may serve me." Moses' brother Aaron is appointed to serve as his spokesman. In Egypt, Moses and Aaron assemble the elders of Israel to tell them that the time of their redemption has come. The people believe, but Pharaoh refuses to let them go and even intensifies the suffering of Israel. Moses returns to God to protest. "Why have you done evil to this people?" God promises that the redemption is close at hand.
Okay. Oops, sorry. A lot's happening this week. Okay, we're going to have a look at a curious incident, which you may have come across before, which the Talmud tells us about the 3 people who were advisors to Pharaoh. So let's have a look. Okay, who would like to read source number 1? Who's volunteering?
Don't rush.
I'll do it.
Go on.
Okay, a new king who did not know of Joseph came to power in Egypt. He said to his people, "The Israelites are becoming too numerous and strong for us. We must deal wisely with them. Otherwise, they may increase so much that if there is war, they will join our enemies and fight against us, driving us from the land." The Egyptians appointed conscription officers over the Israelites to crush their spirits with hard labor. The Israelites were to build up the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for Pharaoh, but the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites proliferated and spread. The Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians started to make the Israelites do labor designated to break their bodies. They made the lives of the Israelites miserable with harsh labor, involving mortar and bricks, as well as all kinds of work in the field. All the work they made them do was intended to break them. Pharaoh then gave orders to all his people, every boy who was born must be cast into the Nile, but every girl shall be allowed to live.
Right. Thank you. It's like the old joke.
Rabbi,
Yes.
the first line, it says a new king who did not know of Joseph. I thought in the Torah, isn't it a new king who did not know Joseph without the of? Because that makes a considerable difference to the meaning
You're
of the
right,
sentence.
it does. So the literal translation is Asher lo yadai Yosef, who didn't know Joseph. You're right. So Rashi says famously, as we've learned before, there are two explanations. One is it was the same king, but he kind of, blinded his, ignored the good that Joseph had done. And the second possibility is actually a new king who didn't know of Joseph. So yes, you're right.
But
I don't know whose translation this was, but by putting the word of in, it does narrow down that you're right. Yes, it sounds more likely that it's not going to be the same Pharaoh. It's going to be somebody who didn't know of his reputation at all. Could be. Yeah, fair point. It's a translation, I think, from Safaria website. So it's not. It is at the end of the day an English translation, which by definition often narrows down the nuance. So you're right. Yeah, so the children of Israel are increasing and multiplying, right? I'm sure you know the old joke about the two rabbits that were surrounded by foxes, and one said to the other, "What should we do?" He said, "Well, we just stay here till we outnumber them," right? So, obvious question. We know Pharaoh. We know from later on that he's a bit of a. By the way, in this week's Parsha, he of course dies, and a new Pharaoh takes over, who's even more draconian. So it seems to have gone with the office of being a bit of a dictator, etc. It wasn't just this Pharaoh, right? So I just read an article somewhere why Tony Blair hasn't received a knighthood yet when most former prime ministers have, and it's causing a logjam because you've then got Brown and Cameron and Theresa May. So it was saying that the Queen was upset with him because he apparently he was quite outspoken when Diana died. Right now, if anyone's seen the film The Queen or The Crown, any of these things, they portray these things. Whether they portray it accurately or not, I don't know. I do recall vaguely them saying at the time that Mr. Blair broke protocol. Anyway, it sounds a bit far-fetched because I'm sure that the Queen is used to having to show the stiff upper lip. But what was interesting was that supposedly Mr. Blair is supposed to have said publicly, or in one of his, I think in his memoir possibly, which is also very indiscreet, they didn't. The problem was the palace didn't have an Alistair Campbell, right? They didn't have a spin doctor. They didn't have someone guiding them. So the fact is that even if you're Pharaoh and you're a despot, you're always going to have people guiding you or advising you, for better or for worse. And it's essentially what Yosef's role was. So let's have a look at this famous story, which you probably heard before, about Pharaoh's advisors. Who would like to read number 2?
I will.
Morning, by the way. Right, go on, Pam.
Rabbi Hia Bar Abba said that Rabbi Simai says 3 noteworthy people were consulted by Pharaoh in that council where Pharaoh questioned what should be done with the Jewish people. They were Bilam and Job and Yitro.
Right, everyone heard of all those 3?
Yeah.
But why would Pharaoh ask for help from Bilam, Job, and Yitro? Why wouldn't he ask his own advisors, his own Egyptian advisors?
Well, according to this midrash, they were his advisors at the time. Look, I don't know if the chronology works or not. I don't know if it's just a nice story or if it's absolutely true, right? I mean, there are all kinds of. If you believe all the stories, you're gullible. If you don't believe any of them, then you're a heretic. So I don't know how the chronology works or the geography, but just run with it for now. So he asked these 3 because there's an important lesson that we learn from this in terms of how they then the rest of their lives played out. So it could be a mashal, it could be a parable, but just let's not overthink the chronology or the geography. Okay, so the Midrash tells us, the Talmud tells us that Pharaoh, like all good dictators, had people that he consulted. He consulted Bilam, who we know was a prophet, in fact, we'll see in a minute. Job, who was rather unfortunate, the book named after him. And Yitro, of course, later on, was a high priest of Midian. So I suppose it makes sense that you would consult the archbishop of wherever. That's long before he became Moshe's father-in-law. So what did they say? Let's see. Who'd like to read number 3? Any volunteers?
I do. Rabbi here, Bar Abba, teaches what occurred to each of them. Bilam, who advised Pharaoh to kill all sons born to the Jewish people, was punished by being killed in the war with Midian. Job, who was silent and neither advised nor protested, was punished by suffering, as detailed in the eponymous book in the Bible. Yitro, who ran away as a sign of protest, merited that some of his children's children sat in the Sanhedrin.
It's, I guess, so this is what we call midah keneged midah, that you get punished according to, the punishment fits the crime. We often say that God punishes people in the same way that they offended, as it were. So Bilam says, kill all the sons. He ends up getting killed in the war with Midian, which we'll see in a moment. Job, who sits there, thinks, well, you know, no point in my saying anything, it won't make a difference. When he is, we see in the book of Job, when he's suffering, that and he cries out, nobody listens, basically. And Yisro, who runs away, sounds like cowardice, but I think it says elsewhere that he was in danger because of his opposition, and therefore he fled. That he probably did express his opposition before running away. So he said, I'm not happy with this, and he felt his life was in danger. So I suppose in response to his taking a stand for justice and fairness, his children's children sat in the highest court in justice. Okay, let's just look at who these people were. So Bilam, of course, interesting, right? You know, it says at the end of Devarim that no prophet ever rose in Israel like Moshe. Yeah? Who wants to read number 4?
I'll read it if you like.
Brenda.
The verse states, and no prophet arose in Israel like Moses. This intimates that there was indeed a prophet like him among the nations, who Bilam, son of Bor.
So it could have said there was never a person. I always find it very emotional, by the way, reading that part of the Torah where it says, you know, that he spoke to God face to face, and there's never been a prophet like him. And it's like, wow, you know, look what we've lost. Anyway, but the exact phrase the Torah uses is there never arose a prophet like Moshe amongst Israel. Why not say there was never a prophet like Moshe in the whole world? So the Midrash says that there was a prophet like Moshe, but not in Israel. It was amongst the nations of the world. Who was it? It was Bilam. You know, you may recall, although he ultimately was not on the good guys, but he had prophecy. Seems he had greater prophecy than some of the Jewish prophets. And of course, he was sent to curse the Jews, and he failed to do so. And Balak sent him home. Good question what he actually did wrong at that time, because at the end of the day, he opened his mouth, but he said the right thing, as it were. So at the end of the day, you're not punished for what you don't say. You're not punished for your thoughts. But it seems, according to the Midrashic sources, he was punished for his advice to Pharaoh. What happens to him in the end? Let's see. This is in the Parsha of Kisisa. No, sorry. Pinchas, I think. Who would like to read number 5?
I can. God spoke to Moses, saying, take revenge for the Israelites against the Midianites. They mounted a surprise attack against Midian, as God had commanded Moses, and killed all the adult males. They also killed Bilam, son of Beor, by the sword.
Okay, so this is all a bit confusing, but basically, according to that Midrash, he was the one that said kill all the sons, and he ultimately got killed himself in a revenge attack. Right? Good morning and welcome, Stephen, by the way. Nice to see you.
Hi. Hi. Good to see you.
Nice to see you again. Okay, so that's one, right? So let's just be clear. What was Bilam's, I mean, it's fairly obvious what his crime was. Right? His crime was to advocate for genocide, yeah? sounds obvious. Just something to ponder. If Pharaoh comes to you for advice, whose interests are you supposed to be looking out for?
Say that
Well,
again, I didn't catch what you said.
Pharaoh's.
If Pharaoh's come to you for, right, we're saying Balaam sold out the Jewish people because he told Pharaoh that you have to go and kill all the Jewish males. And how could he do that? Okay, it's a pretty draconian solution, but just take a step back for a moment. If Pharaoh comes to you for advice on how to deal with the threat from the growing Jewish population, whose interests should you be looking at when you answer him? Presumably Pharaoh's and Egypt, right? So whilst it was very unpalatable advice, Balaam ultimately was giving Pharaoh advice for his situation. He says, you've got to deal with the Jewish problem, right? Quite literally. I'm not saying he was right. I'm saying it's a little bit harsh to say he should have stood up for the Jews when ultimately he was advising Pharaoh. He may have given a very draconian solution, which unfortunately throughout history has been a solution proposed. But ultimately, he did give Pharaoh advice. He gets killed for it. I guess that ethnic cleansing is not acceptable. Anyway, that's one. Now, what did Job do? He didn't say anything. Usually people don't say anything because they say, what's the point of my saying anything? It won't make a difference. What happened to him? Who would like to read this from Job?
I'll read it again, Rabbi.
Yeah.
One day, as his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the house of their eldest brother, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were ploughing and the she-asses were grazing alongside them, when Sabeans attacked them and carried them off and put the boys to the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you. As he spoke, another came and said, God's fire fell from heaven, took hold of the sheep and the boys, and burned them up. I alone have escaped to tell you.
So this is just the beginning of the book. This is pretty heavy stuff, right? So everything goes wrong for him. And the next part is, which we haven't got on the screen, probably should have put on the screen, is he cries out and nothing happens. So again, it's this midah keneged midah, that when the Jews were threatened in Egypt, he didn't say anything, he sat quietly. So when he himself is going through great suffering, basically no one comes to his aid, no one answers. Anyone know of a similar incident where God says, I'll give you back multiple times in punishment for something? If I tell you, you'll probably know. It has to do with the spies. Anyone remember this? It says that the spies gave their report on Tisha B'Av, which in those days presumably was not Tisha B'Av, fast day.
Yeah.
It's the chronology works out there was the 9th of Av. And of course, what does it say? It says the people cried. And God says, you're crying for nothing. I'll give you something to cry about. You want to cry for nothing? I'll give you something to cry about. And it became Tisha B'Av, became fast day. There's this midah keneged midah. So Balaam had all the boys killed. That was his advice to Pharaoh. He ultimately was killed himself. Job, no point in my saying anything. It's not going to make a difference. When he himself is suffering in the book of Job, I should have put the longer quote here, sorry. But we see throughout the book of Job, when he's suffering, basically he suffers not in silence, but no one comes to his help. Again, right? People say, what's the point of my saying anything? He's not going to change anything. I'll just keep quiet. In fact, actually, if you recall, his friends come and comfort him and they tell him, you brought it upon yourself, which is why it says in Pirkei Avos, don't be like the comforters of Job, which I think is an English phrase as well. Yes, you come along, you say, oh, I'm sorry going through this, but God must be punishing you. He says, no, don't do that. Keep stum. Keep your opinions to yourself. And who was the third one? Yitro, let's have a look at this. One sec. So here, the sword in the stone, the Jewish version. Who would like to read? Nice story here. Any volunteers?
If no one else wants to do it, I'll do it again.
Anyone else want to do it? Iris, over to you then. Oh, Pam.
Rabbi Levi said,
It's okay.
sorry, do you want to do it, Pam?
I don't mind. You can do it. It's okay. Go ahead.
Rabbi Levi said, that staff which was created in the twilight before the first Shabbat was delivered to Adam. Adam delivered it to Enoch, Enoch to Noah, Noah to Shem, Shem to Abraham, Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, and Jacob brought it down into Egypt and passed it on to his son Joseph. When Joseph died and they pillaged his household goods, it was placed in the palace of Pharaoh. Jethro was one of the magicians of Egypt, and he saw the staff and the letters which were upon it, and he desired it in his heart, and he took it and planted it in the midst of his garden. No one was able to pull it out. When Moses came to his house, he went into the garden and saw the staff and read the letters on it, and he put forth his hand and took it. Jethro watched Moses and said, he will redeem Israel from Egypt. Therefore he gave him Zipporah, his daughter, to wife.
So there you go. The legend of Excalibur started here in the Midrash.
But Rabbi, how old is that? How old is that piece?
Much older than the legend of King Arthur. I mean, the Midrash, it would be from I don't know when, but well before I'm assuming the story. I don't know when was the legend of King Arthur made? I don't know. Let's see. Google
Medieval times.
Medieval times, yes. No, I've never
Let's
heard
see,
that story before.
Neither have I. I've learned something new. Let me just look up.
I didn't know that when Joseph died, they pillaged his household goods. That was a bit that
No, I didn't know that.
interested me.
But why did they do that? To
Okay,
Joseph?
Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer is the 8th or 9th century. That's interesting. I would have put it earlier. It's the 8th or 9th century. And let's see when Legend of King Arthur comes from.
That's somewhere in the same region.
100 years later.
Yeah.
Medieval times, 10th century.
10th century.
Oh. Sorry, 1 second. Wales or Celtic? Come on, when is it? When is it? Give me a date. Give me a date. Come on.
I think it was around the same time.
Yeah, medieval. So that's what? 10th, 12th century, it seems.
Yes.
So it's a bit later. Anyway, listen, a lot of legends, go around in different cultures. I'm sure I've told you before, I once was asked to speak at an interfaith thing, and I told the story of, which I always understood as a Breslev story about the two Hasidim that were walking on Shabbos, and they see a woman drowning, and one dives in to save her, and the other says, he says, Yankel, you picked up the woman on Shabbos noch. You picked up the woman after like an hour of this. The other one says, listen, Yankel, I may have picked up the woman, but I put her down again. You're still carrying her in your mind. So I told this story at an interfaith thing, and the Muslim guy said, oh, we have a story like that. Stories cross international boundaries. But the point is that according to this midrash, Yitro was quite a heavy hitter in the Egyptian circles. So he certainly didn't do him any harm that according to this midrash, he ran away from. So we've got Bilam who says, kill them all. Very draconian advice. Now, okay, we'll come back to that in a minute. We've got Job who says nothing and he himself suffers in relative silence. And we've got Yisro who says, I can't abide this. And he runs off and he's rewarded by becoming father-in-law of the greatest rabbi we ever had. And a big shot in Egypt. In amongst the children of Israel. So let's look at this. 1 second. What's my next source? Oh, I don't have any. That's it. Right. So let's just go back. Bilam. We know that Bilam was a prophet. Okay. We don't know if he always had control of his prophecy. By the way, Moshe was very unique. It says he spoke to God face to face. If you look at most of the prophets, God came to them in visions. So they didn't necessarily, he couldn't turn their prophecy on and off, at will. So the story of Bilam in the Parsha of Balak, where basically he goes to curse the Jews and instead different words come out of his mouth because it's prophecy from God, basically like he's possessed, makes sense in all the accounts of the prophets. A lot of the prophecy was, that they were seized by the divine spirit and they started prophesying. Moshe was the one exception that we're told he actually had a sort of direct communication with God where he could speak whenever he wanted to. But most of them, it would come to them. We know even from last week's Seder that Yaakov wanted to reveal. I presume that the patriarchs were very lofty spiritual people that could had some divine insight. And Yaakov, of course, it says in last week's Seder, he wanted to reveal the end, what's going to be at the end of days to his children, and he lost it says the divine spirit left him and he couldn't remember anything, right? So prophecy is not something you can always switch on and off whenever you want. But Bilam was a prophet. So here you've got somebody who we know had insight and foresight, would presumably have been able to guess that one day the Jews will be free and the Egyptians will drown in the sea. And yet with all of that, he gives Pharaoh this advice, which is going to obviously hurt the Jews. But actually, isn't that quite brave of him, really, considering that he presumably could have foreseen what was going to happen, and yet he tells Pharaoh to go to bat against the Jews. So, as an advisor to Egypt, he seems pretty brave. He's not afraid to speak his mind, and yet the Talmud says no, he was punished with death. What about truth and justice? Okay, killing sons is not a policy we advocate. But as I said, unfortunately, it's been a policy throughout history of ethnic cleansing, and we don't believe in it. But it, I suppose, you can see where people are coming from. And just by the way, we just survived the Xmas season, and you have the same. I don't know how much historical truth we put in there. There definitely, the Talmud says there was a historical figure who fits with some of what Yoshko was supposed to have done, but of course their narrative of King Herod and killing the boys, again you have the same idea that whenever there was fear that someone was going to take over, the answer was always, unfortunately, usually genocide. Very extreme response.
Herod was a very extreme man. He killed his own family because he was afraid of them.
At least he was consistent.
Yeah.
So that's Bilam. It's a curious question. Now, we don't like what he did, but relative to what he was supposed to be doing, why was he punished? So here's an interesting question. So I don't want to get too into this. There are probably different views on this. But whilst many people thought the peace process, it's very interesting, by the way, to see the contrast. Those who remember Oslo and what was the one before that? Not Camp David. The Oslo process and it was Oslo, wasn't it? The whole peace process. Those who remember the early days of the Oslo. Sorry?
Oslo Accords, I think it was called.
Yeah, so those who remember the early days of the Oslo Accords, very different from the recent treaties that were signed with the UAE, where, you get the feeling, I don't know if with Egypt it was ever a warm peace when Sadat came to Israel, etc. But the recent treaties signed with Bahrain and the UAE, and one gets the feeling that they're relatively warm relationships. A lot of people are now going to Dubai and stuff that, if they weren't already, there's been a big surge in Israeli and Jewish tourism. I'm assuming that the powers that be feel that it's safe in terms of security. I personally wouldn't be very comfortable going to an Arab country, even if it's one that has a peace treaty with Israel, because 3 weeks ago they didn't have a peace treaty with Israel. How does that work? So one gets the sense that there's a much warmer peace there. If Israel would sign a long-term treaty with the Palestinians now, there'd be a concern that generations of children have been raised to hate Israel and so on. It's not so straightforward. Somehow the peace treaty with the UAE and with Bahrain and these other places seems to be a lot more sort of peaceful, perhaps because they have shared interests, whatever the reason is. But I remember when the Oslo process started, I believe at the time there were those that said that it wasn't good for the Jews, but it actually wasn't good for the Arabs either. It was doing them a disservice. Many people would say it brought more bloodshed, ultimately. We can debate that, and people have different views on that. But just a thought. Knowing what we know about God's promises, and knowing what Bilam should have known from his prophecy, is it a good idea to advise Pharaoh to mess with the Jews?
Definitely not. Definitely not.
Right. Is that actually good? You say, oh, it's good advice for Egypt because it will ultimately put down any rebellion by the children of Israel and contain them. Is that, knowing what we know, is that good advice?
No.
No.
Perhaps Balaam didn't know what was going to happen. Perhaps, as you said, he wasn't in charge of his prophecies. God came to him and took over. Perhaps God didn't tell him what was going to happen. He didn't know. He just thought that he was just giving what he considered to be good advice. Maybe he wasn't aware of what was going to happen in the future.
The assumption seems to be that as somebody with prophecy would have had some inkling, and that he was basically telling Pharaoh what he wanted to hear, rather than what would have been the best course of action. It's interesting. Has anyone seen the film Valkyrie about the plot to kill Hitler later on in the war? There's a thing. I don't know how accurate it is, but it's the later when they start to see that he was losing the war, they basically plotted to overthrow him. They didn't plot to overthrow him because they believed he was an evil dictator and that they wanted to save the Jews and everyone else. On the contrary, they did it because they saw that he was failing to act in what they saw as Germany's interests. So they were potentially more dangerous than he was in that situation. So sometimes you see a dictator and they're failing to act in the country's best interests. That can go either way. Sometimes what you feel are the best interests, unfortunately, is even more heinous. So Bilam could have said to Pharaoh, look, don't mess with the Jews. He didn't. They actually pushed him towards the edge, it seems, from this.
But he did later, didn't he? When Balak once.
Right, so with Balak, he kept messing the Jews. He doesn't get any. Funny enough, I asked this question, it's a good question, which I don't know the answer to it right now. That from the story of Balak, we see that Bilam only had prophecy when God wanted him to. So to be fair, why are we assuming he would have had any insights? Why are we assuming that at all? Why would he have known? I mean, later on, he says all these things about the Jews, but there's no evidence.
That's what I was saying. You can't have it both ways. So either he was in charge of his prophecy or he wasn't.
Yeah, it's a good question. If he's in charge of his prophecy, then the whole story of Balak doesn't make sense because there it's his donkey and it's yeah, you're right. No, sorry, that's Balak. Yeah, it's his donkey and it's it's all very Kafkaesque. It's not straightforward. So you're right. It's a good question. How can this midrash say that Bilam should have known better when we see in the story that he's basically just the famous joke? They say Bilam's donkey spoke, so that teaches you that don't assume that because you have the power of speech it makes you at all intelligent. Even a dumb mule can speak if God wants it to. So the same thing for human beings. So if Bilam was just a channel for the prophecy when it suited God, then you can't expect him to tune in when God doesn't want him to. So, and there's no record anywhere that he had prophecy in this incident. So it's a good question. One second. What's that?
It seems to me that the
want to join us? You have to sit quietly. So that's Bilam anyway. That's
the evil that was placed upon Joseph, which brought the children of Israel to Egypt, and he realized that it was God's will. That could be the same sort of evil that was done by Bilam, because the story had to follow on what happened after that.
Yeah. So in the famous words of Lee Harvey Oswald, he was just a patsy.
Yeah.
It does seem like quite a harsh punishment. But the suggestion is that his advice was actually bad advice. It's not even that his advice was evil as far as destroying the Jews. More than that, it was bad advice for Egypt, ultimately.
Yeah.
Now, what about Job? Interesting. The Talmud tells us there's three of them. Imagine that. You've got three people standing there giving advice. So presumably there's a chance that he'll follow the majority. So Job, right, was what we call a bystander. He stood there, he didn't say anything. And what does the Talmud say? The Talmud says, if we go back, what does it say? 1 second. Job was silent, he neither advised nor protested, he was punished with suffering. Right, what's his problem? What is the job of an advisor?
To advise.
To advise. Right,
He didn't do
right.
anything.
Is it an advisor? Right, he sat on the fence, right? If you're an advisor and you're being asked for advice, sitting on the fence doesn't work. This is every year we have this discussion about, now the kids call it upstanders and bystanders, right? Upstanders are people who stand up to things, bystanders are people who stand by. Every year on Holocaust Memorial Day, there'll be discussions about this. It's not good enough to be a bystander. You can't just stand by while things happen. You have to stand up and be counted. 1 second. Can someone take Gabby? I can't do this still. We learn it from last week's Sedra as well, from Vayigash, that Yehuda stood up to Yosef, and some people say, what was the point? You know, Yehuda standing up to this leader of Egypt, and the answer is sometimes you've just got to make your voice heard. You know, you have to say something. One of the sad headlines I saw on 1st of January was London's first 2 murders of the year, 2 stabbings, I think it was, gang stabbings. There was a time when there was, I mean, ironically, one of the positives of coronavirus is there's less crime because people are out on the streets less. But there was a time there were a lot of black teenagers being killed. And at the time, I had a conversation with a couple of other clergy, including a couple of non-Orthodox clergy and one Christian clergyman. And I said, should we not be coming out with something from the religious leaders about this? And they all said the same thing. They said, there's no point. Ultimately, that community has to get its house in order. They're not going to listen to us telling them that they have to stop killing themselves, each other. It's something that the community itself has to deal with. And I said, but surely there's something to be said for just making a protest and saying, we deplore the loss of life of young, men with their future ahead of them, even though it may be that I'm not in that community, I can't solve the problem, but at least I can cry for the loss of life. And it was interesting that there was, I would say, those who were probably older than me, had been around longer than me, all pretty much said there's no point, which is interesting. Sometimes I disagree. I mean, we didn't say anything at the time, but I disagree. I think sometimes there is a point, these vigils and things. I think sometimes there is a point to protest and to standing up, just so that people don't say, they never said anything. So Job's, certainly if you're an advisor, your job is to advise, not to keep quiet. So number one, Job, again, you can't blame him for not sticking up for the Jews if he was asked to advise about Egypt. But to stand there and say nothing, that doesn't work. Silence is, what is it? Complicity. So Bilam tells Pharaoh, Bilam basically nurtures Pharaoh's megalomania, unfortunately, and his ego and his paranoia, and says, well, his paranoia, he says, you're right, you got to do something about them because they're going to take over. Job sits there and says nothing. He doesn't say anything to protect the Jews, and by the same token, he doesn't say anything to protect Egypt, because by going along with Bilam's plan, that also doesn't help the Egyptians. So sometimes silence is the worst thing of all. As nice as it would have been if he would have stuck up for us, worse than that, he didn't even stick up for Egypt. He just said nothing. Often people think that they can say nothing. It's like when people abstain. Labour Party has this. They abstain from things because they say we can't vote against but we'll abstain, as a protest. What's the point? But they'll say we'll make a stand.
Abstained about Israel. Britain abstained.
Yes, Britain's good at abstaining, unfortunately, in the UN and stuff. I guess it becomes the question. Is it better to abstain than vote against something, or is abstaining just wishy-washy? People say, I'm abstaining because I don't want to vote against it, but at the same time, we don't want to support it. So you're just wishy-washy in a way, sitting on the fence.
I can see the point.
And it's often a political
thing. Sometimes you don't know whether it's right or wrong, so you think, well, best not to say anything. Else you're coming down one way or the other.
Right. or things like MPs abstaining on the lockdown regulations or Brexit. What they're basically saying is we don't really like this, but we can't vote against it because that's not going to work because the country needs it. But we want it not on the record that we're not really happy about it. Or in other words, vote for us next time. As far as the UN, it's very political abstentions. If you look at anti-Israel motions, I don't know what it's like now, but it used to be that the permanent members of the Security Council, Britain sometimes, America often would use their veto, but other countries would abstain. They wouldn't vote against Israel, but they'd abstain. Which I guess in some ways is better than they're voting against Israel, but as you say, it's wishy-washy. Are you with me or are you against me? What are you sitting on the fence for? You want to please everyone. It doesn't work. Jethro, so it's not that he ran away so much, that the suggestion is that he wasn't comfortable with it, and presumably he spoke up and he ran away because he was fearful for his life. So why did he speak up, and why is he rewarded for that? So you've got Bilam who says kill the kids, he's punished. Job is silent, he's punished. So what's the logical thing to do? You've got one guy, you've got a despot who's paranoid. You've got one guy saying, yeah, you're right. Go on a campaign of mass genocide to solve the problem. And I'm using that in quotes as an unfortunate word that's been used throughout the ages. You've got another guy who just sits on his hands and says nothing, hear no evil, see no evil. What's your option? So to oppose Bilam is probably quite irrational. You're going to have one-on-one. But the Midrash tells us that he did speak up. And spoke up, basically, because sometimes you've got to speak up. Not because it's rational, not because it's logical, but it's the right thing to do. When someone says, well, I didn't say anything because I thought it would make it worse. Sometimes you just got to speak up. You've got to stand up and be counted. According to Midrash, that's what Yisro did. And that's why he had to flee. Because he was the one that said, don't do it. It's not the right thing to do. And so they wanted to kill him for that. By the way, you find that through history. The prophet Jeremiah, I think the people wanted to kill him because of his miserable prophecies. People often don't want to hear the truth. I'm guessing if you're a despot and you're asking your advisors, there's a reasonable chance that you expect them to just rubber stamp it. You're not really expecting them to say, don't go through with it. And you chose the one that's rewarded. Ultimately, A, with becoming Jewish and the father-in-law of Moses, but B, that his children, his descendants sat in justice, right? Because he didn't stay silent, and he didn't advocate, obviously, for murder. He spoke up, according to Midrash. Interesting. So the path that leads to justice, to the Sanhedrin, to the High Court in Jerusalem, is the path of being outspoken when necessary. Basically,
sometimes if it's cut and dry that something's evil and something's good, then there's no problem about speaking up. But sometimes we're not given all the facts, and we can make a decision not knowing everything. And sometimes we can speak up, and then we found later that we were wrong, and then we made it more difficult. And you've got to apologise, and so sometimes it's best to keep quiet.
Correct. There's a trend now happening, which is a very worrying trend, that let's say, I don't know, let's say I sign up, okay, let's go back to that example. Let's say I sign a petition that, I don't know, the mayor should do more to prevent youth violence, particularly in amongst young, whatever the correct term nowadays is, black communities. And that petition's online. And I sign it in good faith as a clergyman that I deplore loss of life. And then it gets signed by an extremist as well. People will turn around and say, Rabbi Wallenberg, how could you possibly share a platform with this extremist here? It's the new thing. Or if somebody says, I like the new, I don't know, whatever. What books come out recently? I'm not going to say Harry Potter because she's controversial as well. I don't know, somebody's written a book and I say on my Twitter, I like this book. And somebody else who happens to be a extremists says they like this book, people will connect us. And they'll say, oh, you see, you're sharing, and people have lost their jobs over this in America, academics and things, because they've expressed an opinion, or they've liked something, or they've advocated something, and because of their bedfellows, they've paid the price for it. And we live in a world, a very unforgiving world. Rabbi Sachs spoke about it a couple of years ago, one of his Selichot addresses, where at the beginning, I think it was in Hampstead Shul. It's really scary.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're doing. Or for example, let's say I was asked, Rabbi Wallenberg, would you like to give some greetings to I don't know, whatever whatever, I don't know, the Queen on her 90 birthday, I don't know, and I record a short video clip, and then the video clip gets shown, but then the person after me is some national action extremist. People say to me, how could you share a platform? I say, oh, I didn't even know. You don't know half the time. So you're right, it's really difficult in the world we live in. When you express an opinion on something, if you're not really careful as to the context, you can really come unstuck on social media. And I remember when there was a time when they were calling for the banning of burqas, and people at the time were saying, yes, it's a good thing, it's stop extremism and so on. And we're going back at least 10 years, I think, in this country. And I gave a sermon, I remember, I said, before you get all excited about this, I said, I've got two things to say to you. I said, number one, we also believe in modesty. Now, what would you do if we were told that we couldn't practice our modesty, that women can't wear hats because it's too intimidating, or shaitels? I said, number two, look at the people who are advocating this. They are not people that you want as your bedfellows. They're the far right. And these are not people, even if you're comfortable with such a belief, these are not people you want to be sharing a platform with. And that's often the case. And you're right, it's very nuanced. So you could even turn around to someone and say, well, someone say, I didn't speak up because I didn't know both sides of the story and I didn't want to say the wrong thing. There's a wonderful clip. You can see it on YouTube. If you haven't seen it before, go search for the, I've got to get this right. There's a bunch of guys with clipboards and they're standing outside. I think it was a campus in America, one of the really liberal campuses like Berkeley or somewhere, which is known to be really left wing. And they've got clipboards and they're saying, will you sign this petition, please, to ban dihydric oxide? Say, what is it? Say, it's a chemical. Say, it's in the rivers, it's in the streams, it's in your bloodstream. It kills thousands of people every year. It pollutes. And everyone signs it. And of course, what is it? H2O is water, right? H2O, water.
Yeah,
people will believe anything. Afterwards, they say to them, you've just signed a petition banning water. And they're like, oh, we didn't realize. So this is one of the problems. And maybe thousands of years ago, it was easier because you didn't have social media. But Brenda's actually just hit the nail on the head. It's very easy to criticize people for not speaking up, for being bystanders. But if you ask yourself objectively, it's not always so clear. Where the lines are. The chief rabbi came out with something about this Muslim minority in China. What are they called? I don't know how you pronounce it.
Uyghurs or something.
Right,
Uyghurs,
and he said, we can't stay silent. We can't stay silent any longer. And my first thought was, I did some research on it, and it does seem like they're being oppressed by the Chinese government. But many times you hear about, if you remember the conflicts in Bosnia and Serbia, and you hear about conflicts, and you hear about who the oppressed party is, and then the next day you hear that they're oppressing the other side, and it's not so clear who's the victim. Things are not always black and white. So it's easy to say you should speak up, and then when we do speak up, we often get criticized or told off, or how can you speak up? Black Lives Matter, right, is in America at least has been identified as being quite anti-Israel. So as somebody said, do Black Lives Matter? Yes, with lowercase letters. So do I believe that every person counts and that there are imbalances in the world and there's institutionalized racism in certain countries, including this country, which definitely needs addressing? Yes. So I want to sign up to a movement with capital letters, Black Lives Matter, which then means that immediately I'm buying into their manifesto, whatever that is, always more problematic. Because once you start buying into manifesto, then well, wait a minute, do I agree with all of their manifesto? Well, if I don't, I've got a problem. Always a problem with these things. And it's very difficult. It's very difficult.
This social
media. A lot
media.
of people are just naive. They sign things.
This social media is a blessing and a curse. this Twitter thing
Absolutely.
is not good, like you're saying. You get caught out on it. It's a curse, really.
Two-edged sword, do they call
You know,
it?
if I was asked on the 6 o'clock news, you know, how our community is coping with the pandemic, and then the next minute they asked a far right nationalist leader how their community is coping with the pandemic, and then people said to me, "How can you go on a program with this guy?" I think, well, I didn't know they were going to show. You know, this is always the problem.
Yeah.
And it's getting worse, unfortunately. You know, this whole J.K. Rowling business. I don't know if she's right or wrong, but you know, this no platforming and this, you know, free speech is getting trampled on a lot. It's very scary, actually. So you can't just speak up and say your opinion. You know, and
Well,
sometimes if you
because
speak up, that's also wrong.
everyone has their own rights. That's the problem. Everyone's got their own rights, and that's it. And you know,
Right.
you can't say anything about anything.
Just out of interest, how would I express an opinion about the tragedy of youth violence, predominantly, almost exclusively within the black community, and not be accused of singling out a community or profiling?
Yeah,
Can't be done.
can't be done.
That's also right. So you see the problem. So it's easy to criticize people for not speaking up,
Yeah.
but you see the problem. How do you speak up in an effective manner? Nonetheless, I would say sometimes you just got to say it, even if you don't know what impact it will have. That nobody can say, I never spoke out. Rabbi Safran has a story I heard years ago that there was a couple that were gonna, I don't know if this works nowadays, by the way. Anyway, I must ask him actually, because I didn't hear the story from him, but I'm sure it's true. There was a couple that were going to marry out, and I think they were due to get married the next day or something. I think it was in Glasgow, and Reverend A.D. Safran traveled with somebody else. I think it may have been Rabbi Shmuel. Two of them went up to see this couple and talk to them, and tried to persuade them not to marry out. And in the end, they still married out. And somebody said afterwards, you know, what effect did it have? He said, the effect is they can never say nobody told them it was wrong, because somebody took the time to actually speak up and explain to them. Sometimes that's what it's about. You know, you may not achieve your objective, but at least you said something. Nobody can say that nobody cared. Sometimes that's a very important principle. It's not very fashionable nowadays, but sometimes it's a very important principle. So, you know, there's a lot we could say. Look, it's just a midrash that's brought in the Talmud. That explains what they all did right or wrong. And also, by the way, sometimes when you speak up, you put your life at risk. I always wondered about these stories about parents that, you know, would take a bullet for their child. You know, on the one hand, of course, what parent wouldn't protect their child? On the other hand, you're not much use to your children dead either. So, you know, the type of things we posturing and grandstanding and so on, no, sometimes it's not so helpful. There we go. Anyway, it's something to mull over and think about. It's very, very contemporary, as we said. Very contemporary. Speaking out.
Two sayings come to my mind.
Yeah.
My enemy's enemy is my friend. And if you're going to sup with the devil, use a long spoon.
Yes.
So, you know,
Absolutely.
you don't know where you stand, do you?
Yeah. Yeah. And as you said, that anyone who's learned Tanya will know also that the good and evil is not always easy to identify. Sometimes what we think is good is not actually good, and sometimes what we think is evil is not as evil as we think.
It'll all come clear when Mashiach comes.
Sorry?
It'll all be clear when Mashiach comes.
Mashiach comes. But in the meantime, we live in a very murky world. We don't live in a black and white world. You know, if everything was black and white, life would be easy. It's like anything. If choices were black and white, if your choices, if your Yetzer Tov, your Yetzer Hara, if you saw the consequence of following the wrong path or following the right path, but we don't. So all this pontificating about different advisors and how you advise people and speaking up or staying silent or advocating genocide, all these things, you know, and before you say that, if anyone's going to say that genocide is never right, when the Allies bombed, you know, Germany during the war and they carpet bombed cities, did they think they weren't going to kill people?
Dresden.
Right? What you thought people were going to survive that? Is that not genocide?
Yeah.
Is that not genocide? Is that not, you know, mass killing? Let's be honest. That was the military strategy.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you talk about, you think about, genocide, like in the conventional sense, of course we couldn't advocate genocide. Pearl Harbor, not Pearl Harbor, what do you call it? Hiroshima, Nagasaki. What was that not genocide?
It was.
Definitely.
And yet people say, save the world from further war. So who's right, who's wrong, who's good, who's evil? It's not so clear. I always remember the head teacher, King David Liverpool. We were talking to her. She wasn't Jewish, really nice lady, Rachel Rick, and we were talking to her about how you incorporate. It's a bit of a hobby horse of mine and Blimmer's, that in a Jewish school the curriculum should have a Jewish flavor to it. So you can teach kids counting in nursery by counting the Hanukkah candles. It doesn't have to be Jewish studies. You can make it Jewish. In your history, you can learn. In my school, we learn Jewish history as much as possible. So she said it was really interesting how you get different perspectives on things. She said, for example, Cromwell was hated in Christian circles. It was seen as as a whatever, I don't know, as anti-establishment. But of course, to the Jews, he was a hero because he let the Jews back in. Right, Nelson Mandela, of course. Or even you have, closer to home, Jerry Adams and people like that. Hardly heroes, but they got sanitized and became politicians. But Nelson Mandela is the classic one. I remember a time when he was seen as a terrorist, and nobody says that anymore. So it's never as black and white as we think, and that's one of the problems. But it's not going to be solved overnight. Anyway, there we go. How's everyone doing?
Yes, fine. I wanted to ask you something to do with the Sedra before last, because we didn't have a share this week.
No.
You were reading through it, and the brothers were coming down to Egypt. They named all the children, and I noticed that Benjamin had 6 sons when he came down. I always thought he was a youth when he was, and I couldn't quite work this out.
I don't know the chronology, but yeah, and he named them all after Joseph as well in different ways. Like very, very, very subtle. Rashi says, like he called one of them was called Chupim, I think. He said, because I'm going to miss my brother's chuppah and things like that. Does it say how old he was?
Not really.
I mean, alive. Did he know that he was born? Was he born before he got sold?
Yeah, of course. He was the one that recognized Joseph. Yeah.
But isn't it always the way that to an older person, a young person is a kid? I mean, your parents, even when you're in your 40s or 50s, your parents still think of you as a kid. So maybe the older brothers say, we have a brother, a young one. He's only a kid because he was a lot younger than they were.
Yes.
So he is a kid throughout the story. He never thinks for himself, really.
Yeah.
Right? He's always portrayed as a little kid. I don't know how old he actually was. How old was he when the goblet incident took place?
Or something.
Well, if Joseph was 17, you could work it back because I don't know the difference in ages.
And 22 years later.
So he was less than 17, wasn't he?
And then there was 2 years into the famine, wasn't there? So it's about 24. I don't know. It just struck me as, when we were reading it.
Chronology.
I think it's just the difference in. I think it's just the difference in ages between the older brothers and Benjamin. That they just think and they're just maybe they're exaggerating for this high Egyptian official, trying to make it sound even worse. That they would take him away. He's only a kid. You can't possibly make us take him away.